Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special bonus episode of Daily Dose of Aramaic. In this episode, I'd like to share with you my presentation for the 2024 meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in San Diego, California. For the Aramaic section, I made this presentation, which has to do with the rendering of the Hebrew Nephal into Jewish literary Aramaic. That's very timely because lately we've been reading in Targum Obadiah, which, as you know, is part of Targum Jonathan, which is in Jewish literary Aramaic. So this directly plays into our readings recently. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to interacting with comments that you'll have on my presentation. Well, again, I'm Scott Callahan. I'm the Dean of the Institute of Public Theology, which is a new seminary in Florida. And in a more focused way for our session today, I'm the host of Daily Dose of Aramaic. So if you all have students that you want to encourage them to continue their learning of Aramaic after you teach them, a principle of second language acquisition is every day, if you can have even just the smallest input, that's helpful for getting it in there in your mind and continuing to learn. And so here you go, a free resource, Daily Dose of Aramaic. So go to the website, dailydoseofaramaic.com, and have your students sign up and subscribe. And every weekday, 1 to 3 minute video. So we turn now to the presentation today. Before anything else, I want to thank Dr. Gottlieb and Aquinas Bible Software for shaving probably 100 hours off of this study with the Targum's equivalent project word map. So for the technical introduction, that's what the program book is for, the abstract. Let me give the non-technical introduction, the shorter, and we'll just go right into it. So formal correspondence or formal equivalence is a Bible translation philosophy that we see, for instance, in the SBL Study Bible that's for sale here, the New Revised Standard Version, Jewish Publication Society version of the Bible, where there's an attempt to have a one-for-one correspondence. Firstly, on the shallowest level, perhaps a word-for-word kind of thing. The original biblical language, this word consistently represented by this word in the translation language. And then, of course, if possible, that's hard enough already, but if possible, a reflection of grammar and syntax, a kind of structural equivalence or correspondence is a goal in formal correspondence translation. It's really hard to do, especially if the translation language, like English, is so different from the biblical language, like the Hebrew or the Aramaic sections of the Hebrew Bible. So many compromises along the way, unless what you're merely doing is some sort of interlinear, an unreadable translation, which is not really a translation at all, in a sense. So wouldn't it be great if we had a language where one-for-one translational equivalents were not only possible, but actually the semantic ranges chosen were very similar? Wouldn't that be great? To test theories about formal correspondence? And wouldn't it be great if we had a translation language where if you mirror grammatical and syntactical choices in the biblical language, if you mirror that, it's going to make sense in the translation language? Unlike, in English, we don't have a lot of verb, subject, object sentences. Wouldn't it be great if there were such a test case language? Well, of course, there is one of these, Jewish literary Aramaic. So let's get into this to kind of explore a question about formal correspondence Bible translation via our test case of Jewish literary Aramaic. So here we go. According to Lipinski, Semitic languages have this idealized possibility set for what you could have for binyanim, the stems, the verb stems. So I'm not implying that the end stem is on the G line, but here you have the basic stems, the doubled middle radical stems, and the so-called causative stems, and the N off to the side. So this is, in theory, what a given Semitic language could do with a binyan system. So in Biblical Hebrew, this is what we have, where there's no TG, there's no reflexive that's functional in the verbal system that we see in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, you've already probably seen here, I'm going to gray out Kal passive and Hishtafel, which are not really productive across the broad range of the Hebrew Bible, thus leaving us the 7 stems that we teach all the time when we teach elementary Hebrew, with Nifal off to the side. Of course, I've talked about sort of the horizontal arrangement here. The vertical arrangement is such that you have, for example, the kal. So the next box over would be the passive modification of kal, and then the next box over would be the reflexive. Okay, so because there's an absence of a good functional kal passive in Hebrew, and because there's not at all a TG, what happens is often the nifal will rush in, it seems, to represent these ideas. It seems. Thus, we can call the nifal perhaps a mediopassive reflexive, even if we're just describing what function it appears to have in Hebrew. Well, this is what we have in biblical Aramaic, and that's not our topic today, but just to shift over to the Aramaic of the time of the Bible, it's a different configuration of stems. And we just notice immediately, well, there's no kual, at least attested for sure in Aramaic languages of the time. Doesn't seem to be any in the Bible, but more importantly, no end stem. And this is, according to Lipinski, one of sort of the distinguishing factors about Aramaic, no end stem. So let's come over into Jewish literary Aramaic. What does the stem system look like? Well, there's a simplification by this time where the mediopassive reflexive stems take over the function of what had previously been set aside, special passive stems, such that, in fact, the TG, TD, and TC stems here actually represent passive more often, it seems, in the text than their original, so to speak, reflective sense. And it's interesting, in Jewish literary Aramaic, there are actually a good number, as compared to the Bible, of shafels and ishtafels, just more roots available that are attested in those stems with, we presume, a similar meaning as the afel and the itafal. Okay, so if that's onkelos, Jewish literary Aramaic, the language which the Torah is being translated into, then here we have biblical Hebrew on the left and its stem system. How, in general, will a formal equivalence strategy translate these Hebrew verb stems? Well, in mostly expected ways, actually. So, of course, the active stems. Well, we have active stems that fit in the same scheme. And, well, the passive and the reflexive stems. Yes, we have a scheme for this already in Jewish literary Aramaic. But what about the nifal? So, of course, that's what this topic is about today. We would think, because we're labeling in this simplified system the nifal a mediopassive reflexive, and because we're labeling the TG, the itpa'el, a mediopassive reflexive, well, of course, the itpa'el will be the translator's choice, even though there's no end stem, so to speak, in Aramaic to call upon. Of course, that's what onkelos will do. Actually, less than half the time does he do that. So this is where it kind of starts to get interesting. Less than half the time, 47%. And, don't hold me to the abstract when I actually tracked down all 887 nifals in the Torah. The statistics were slightly different than what I presumed they were before I started. But it's sort of, from a research standpoint, uninteresting that there are 47% of these that are itpa'el, because that's sort of what we expected. And also from a research perspective, if onkelos should choose to use the TD or the TC to translate the nifal, that's less interesting as well. So I'm going to gray that out. What about when onkelos uses active voice stems to translate his nifals before him in the Torah? And then there's this other category that we can look at as well. This is the interesting part. So what I'm going to do in the remaining time here is just kind of go through these examples of the active voice stems and the others. And it's a really good thing, thanks so much for the tech support, to be able to put it on the screen, because this would be rather tedious if I just said it. So we have some visual here. So as far as these active voice stems go, converting from percentages to numbers, so we can count down, we can account for all of these examples. let's start with something where we were like, well, of course, if you have verbs where there's no kal, and thus it appears in our reading of the Hebrew that the nafal is actually an active voice-based idea, well, then it's unsurprising that these would get translated in Jewish literary Aramaic using an active voice stem. So just quick examples of that. For the Hebrew column, these are all nafals, okay? For the Aramaic column, they're GDC. So that's what I'm doing in positioning them in such a way. So just these examples right here in Genesis 18:2 translation, he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men standing over him. That's nafal participle, masculine plural. In onkelos, same idea, 3 men standing over him. There's no need to try to search for an itpael or something like that, some sort of passive reflexive stem. I mean, we've got a nice active voice idea here, and the pa'al fits perfectly great. What about using a D stem to translate the nafal? Well, here we have, and now swear to me in God, right? Nafal imperative. Well, here's a pa'al imperative, and now swear to me in the memra of Adonai. So, of course, this isn't exact formal equivalence in onkelos, so a little bit of a departure. But we know why he does this in Targum studies. What we're focusing on is the verb here. So it's fine to us to see, interestingly, the same kum verb as what we had seen in the G line there, just taking this meaning of swearing in the D stem, and it looks like a great fit. Wonderful. We move on to the C. Adonai will fight for you, and you will be silent. This nafal imperfect, third masculine singular. And then here we have an afil. Adonai will fight a battle for you. So slightly different, but I mean fighting and fighting a battle, same idea. And you will be silent. So again, using these active voice stems makes total sense when it seems like the nafal itself, because there is no kal for one thing, but it looks like the nafal itself is an active voice idea, so to select active voice verbs for an active voice idea. Intuitive, no problem. Okay, so let's take those out of the equation. And then we remind ourselves, oh, wait, in Aramaic, the G, D, and C stems, well, they have passive participles, kind of like in Hebrew, the kal active and the kal passive participle. Yes. Okay, so this makes sense of occasions when onkelos would draw upon this system of the alleged active voice to translate a passive idea. So in Deuteronomy 21:1, it is not known, is known, who killed him with the nafal perfect. And here we have the pa'al passive participle, it is not known who killed him. And, going quickly, because of course time concerns, finite verb versus, a participle is a verbal adjective. I mean, that's a little bit different, but Aramaic uses its participles slightly differently from Hebrew. This makes sense in context. It is a passive participle of an active stem. But look at this. We presume the same translator, right? Onkelos? He also, it seems, feels free to use the itpael perfect third masculine singular, which you would have thought would be a closer translation in Deuteronomy 21:1. So that's on the top, and then Genesis 41:21 on the bottom, that itpael example. So we step back and ask ourselves kind of a critical thinking question about the formal correspondence theory, at least of onkelos. Why didn't he choose the itpael perfect third masculine singular? You'd think that would be closer in a formal correspondence way than a pa'al passive participle. So it seems to me that what we see from the data here is that it's acceptable, at least in onkelos's formal correspondence theory, to choose a near structural equivalent, even when it looks like you have a more exact structural equivalent that you could draw upon. It seems near is okay. It seems that there's sort of a priority of meaning, even in onkelos's formal correspondence, over the abstract idea of formal correspondence. Isn't that interesting? Because, we have a lot of compromises in our English formal correspondence Bible translations. It's kind of hard to be able to point to something semi-subjective because, right now I'm speaking English. but my native speaker intuition of English is irrelevant for what the text means. It's just what feels good in English as I'm talking here. So we have a relatively objective, very similar language that we see a near structural equivalent appears to be okay over the closer equivalent. Okay, so let's subtract those. We're getting smaller and smaller numbers here. Now let's look, for the sake of convenience, at this when Onkelos chose not to use a verb. It's interesting to me, so few times does Onkelos just make hardly any effort at all to translate. Only 4 times out of 887 nifals. So let's get that out of the way. So Numbers 12:12. Half of his flesh is consumed. Okay, so the is consumed. Well, the Onkelos translation is just the dead flesh that is upon her. And so this is interesting. It is actually a her baby. And Numbers 12:12. So why a masculine singular in the Hebrew is another question. But here, there's nothing really that goes with the exact idea that this dead flesh has been consumed. So that idea is just not in Onkelos there. But only 4, it's like 0.5 or less % of the examples does Onkelos not make an effort to translate. So that's an interesting thing here. This formal correspondence that it seems like we see in Onkelos, he wants to translate. He wants to render something, and just in a few cases chooses not to. Okay, what about using a noun? Deuteronomy 33:29. Who is like you, a people saved by Yahweh, by Adonai? So you see the agent phrase there with the bait in front of Adonai. Who is like you, a people saved by Adonai? And then you have in the Onkelos, there is no one like you, a people whose deliverance is from before Adonai. Well, the deliverance, that's a noun idea that corresponds to saving. So we know what Onkelos is doing here. Good. Understand that. 13 is a pretty small number in the face of 887, but that makes sense. What about adjectives? Well, we remember participles are actually verbal adjectives. So perhaps this is why this is an even more comfortable translation for Onkelos, just linguistically, to use an adjective instead of something like a participle. So here we have in the Nifal, and he was more honored than anyone in his father's house. And he was more honored than anyone in his father's house is our literalistic translation of the Onkelos. Word for word, that adjective did exactly the job, it seems, of the Nifal participle. Great. And then there's a little subset that we can see among the adjectives used to translate Nifal of using a periphrastic construction. So look at this. Nifal imperative feminine singular, be free from the water of bitterness in the Hebrew. Be free, same thing, but here the be is the imperative rather than be free, be put together as a verb idea. Be, and then an adjective, free. So same meaning, right? But just rendered with a periphrastic construction with an adjective. And this is the reason why I wanted to talk about that last in putting the other nonverbal translations behind us. It's because there's actually a periphrastic using a more verbal expression. So here we have in Genesis 24:8, you will be free from this, my oath. You will be free from this, my oath, where the be, again, is he vav yod in Onkelos, with the free idea being a verbal adjective, being a participle, instead of a straight-up adjective. So there are just a few of those. There's 4 of those, so we will now subtract them. What have we learned in looking at this subset of not using a verb, to translate? Well, Onkelos left very few untranslated nifals. He feels free, apparently, to draw upon adjectives and nouns when just his linguistic resources probably drove him to that. And again, adjectives are very good translations for some of these verbal adjectives, participles. And then for stative ideas, he felt comfortable with periphrastic expressions. Stative ideas in Hebrew. Maybe he didn't have a stative idea in a verb in Aramaic, so he used be, with the stative idea, however was best to render it. So as we reflect on formal correspondence translations, whether it's to our languages or to some language that doesn't have a Bible yet, I think this is valuable for considering what, at least in Onkelos' opinion, a guy who apparently practiced formal correspondence, what was acceptable in terms of a good formal correspondence translation. Okay, and then, you try to account for every last example in a study like this. So I have a spreadsheet of 887 lines and many, many columns. Again, that's the 100 hours being shaved off, probably using the Targum's word map. There's one example in all of this where it's a hapax legomenon that I sort of don't have a way of commenting what was the strategy here of translating. So throw that out. Let's look at when we have the case of a cognate verb, meaning the Hebrew and the Aramaic use the same consonants. So yod, dalet, ayin. But by my name, Adonai, I was not known. Interestingly, active voice expression here, but my name, Adonai, I did not cause them to know. What's going on here? Israel Drazen says, the Targumist transforms the biblical passive I was not made known into the active, the form of speech that he, as modern writers, generally prefers. So it's a very astute comment that just happens not to be true for this particular one, because when Yod Dalet Ayin gets represented in Onkelos with Yod Dalet Ayin, actually it's most often a passive, meaning the nifal comes over into a passive idea in Onkelos normally. So what's going on with this one example to the contrary? It's a guess. This is talking about the patriarchs not knowing the name Adonai. Is it just something that needed to be highlighted that's better highlighted with active voice? That's a guess on my part. We continue cognate verb ideas, this idea of being consumed. Well, fire coming out and consuming. What's going on here? We have the same agent, same patient. So using that kind of way of talking instead of object and subject, because it changes with voice change. Same agent, same patients. In these cases, there is a preference for active voice. That's interesting. It seems more direct, and maybe that was more natural in Aramaic. And a big category of this is circumcision. So there are 15 times that you have the mem, vav, lamed verbal root transformed into an active expression in Aramaic. And that's not all. We have lots of these. So I'm even running out of space on the screen. To make this relevant, let me show you. I'm highlighting the Aramaic here, and I've got some statistics. We love statistics. Okay, so except for in the middle here where the percentage is the same, you see there's going to Aramaic. What I'm showing is in the overall distribution of active and passive stems, the Hebrew is low, the Aramaic is high for the translation into Onkelos' Aramaic. So filling the screen and moving on to the next screen, same thing, except for the case of Asa, there is a greater degree of active voice use in what Onkelos felt was the appropriate word to translate. Okay, getting low on our remaining number to explain here. For you, Adonai, are seen, eye to eye, versus who with their eyes have seen the Shekinah of the glory of Adonai. Again, same agent, same patient, preference for active voice. Now we're getting a little bit away from formal equivalence because of the insertion of other ideas. Thank you. And your roads will be deserted, and your roads will be deserted. What's going on here with this? Well, this seems to be where the kal and the nifal had actually the same idea. This sort of stative idea. So the mere fact that the Hebrew's in the nifal is actually, it doesn't seem to affect Onkelos' translation. So if the nifal means the same thing as the kal, okay, we understand. And we're almost there. Only 4 more examples. On the mountain of Adonai, it will be provided is a traditional rendering of the seeing verb idea. So I'm not committed to provided or whatever. But interestingly, Onkelos says, on this mountain, Abraham worshipped Adonai. Interesting. What's going on here? So there are just a very, very few times, just kind of like when Onkelos didn't feel obligated to translate, that he altered the meaning from whatever's in the verb of seeing. It's not necessarily this serving, this worshiping idea with pelam and chet. Very few, but when he did, when he altered the meaning for nifal, he went with active voice, interestingly. So what have we learned very quickly? Only 4 examples of altered meaning, only 4 examples of no translation. Active voice verbs for active voice ideas in Onkelos. Yes. And that idea about a near structural equivalent is okay, even when you have a closer match of structure available. And then when you can match the meaning with nouns and adjectives instead of trying to find a verb, okay, according to Onkelos. And then periphrastic expressions are acceptable for stative ideas. And lastly, Onkelos does, Israel Drazen said correctly, does have a preference for active voice in many cases. When we have the same agent, same patient, and his translational choices, he goes for Aramaic roots that have a higher percentage, usually, of active voice representation than the Hebrew roots that he's translating from. So his transformation to active voice is significant, it seems, in all of these cases. And of course, the few cases when the nifal appears to have the same meaning as kal, why not use active voice to translate it? So that brings us to the end successfully within the period of time that I had. So thank you. It's an honor to be able to present the fruits of this research to you.